Thank you for watching this video about pre-registration. My name is Xenia Schmalz and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the University Hospital of Munich, as well as an ambassador for the Center of Open Science. First, I'd like to convince you that pre-registration is important. If you've watched the video by Professor Anne-Laure Boel-Steeks about p-hacking, she has already set the background for this talk. She has talked about 3 different sources of bias that lead to a systematic bias in the literature, where quite often we show the presence of effects which don't actually exist in real life. If you haven't watched this video yet, I recommend that you do so before you move on to this video. But just to summarize, there are 3 sources of bias. The garden of forking paths, also known as p-hacking, where researchers take one data set and conduct many different analyses on it. And just by chance, even if the data consists only of random noise, eventually you will find a significant p-value. And p-hacking is publishing this one analysis, the one significant p-value, as a positive finding, and neglecting to mention that you have conducted a lot of other analyses that did not give you a significant effect. Publication bias is when only positive findings are published, so studies with non-significant results are just put away in a file drawer. This can happen either because authors choose not to submit studies with non-significant findings, or journals choose to reject submissions which did not find a significant p-value. The third source of bias is harking or hypothesizing after results are known, where exploratory analysis is sold as a confirmatory study, and after the results have already been analyzed, the authors rewrite the introduction to predict exactly what they found after they had looked at the analysis. What is pre-registration exactly, and how can it stop these questionable research practices? A pre-registration, formally speaking, is a publicly available, time-stamped, non-modifiable document which has to be uploaded and time-stamped before data collection is initiated. This document should outline the hypothesis of the study, the proposed methods, as well as detail the data processing and analysis pipeline. It helps against publication bias because this document exists and is publicly available, so everybody has access to the information that you are planning to do this study. It works against harking because we have to outline our hypothesis before we start data collection, and therefore obviously before we have a chance to look at the results. And it prevents p-hacking because we have to specify the data processing and analysis pipeline in advance, which reduces the number of paths that we can go if we think about the garden of forking paths metaphor. So how does pre-registration fit in with a standard project life cycle? We can see the standard project life cycle here. We start off by developing our idea, designing a study, acquiring the material, preparing the material. And then before we start with the data collection, if we do a pre-registration, we upload it at this point, just before we start data collection. If you want to upload a pre-registration, there are several platforms where you can do this. For clinical studies, clinicaltrials.gov is the standard place to go. If you have more theoretical studies, or if you are not from clinical sciences, you can use the Open Science Framework or the As Predicted platforms. After you upload your pre-registration, you go on as usual, you collect your data, you analyze it in accordance with what you promised to do in the pre-registration. You interpret the data, the results, and write up the report. And then you include a link to the pre-registration in the manuscript, so a link to this time-stamped document. And along with the link, you can submit it to any journal. So the reviewers and the readers will have access to the pre-registration, and they can compare what you did with what you promised you would do. If you want to write a pre-registration, it is not that different from some parts of a traditional paper, so to say. The information that should be in a pre-registration overlaps with the introduction, methods, and results section of a classical paper. In the introduction, we talk about what is our hypothesis and how exactly will we test it. In the method section, we specify what type of data will be collected, which variables, how will we manipulate if we have an experimental design or a treatment, what will be the manipulation, and how will we ensure that the manipulation is successful. Of course, we can't write a results section because we don't have the data yet, because we have to upload the pre-registration before the data analysis, before the data collection step. But we should write a proposed analysis section. Here we should outline how the data will be processed. For example, how will outliers be removed, based on what criteria, and also how will we analyze the data and which particular analysis, which particular number will give us evidence either for or against our hypothesis. Pre-registration can be, the format of a pre-registration can be flexible. You can write it as a text, but if you prefer, you can just write bullet points. If you are unsure about what information to include, you can always check out the templates, which you can find on aspredicted.org or on the Open Science Framework. As a general rule, the more details you include in a pre-registration, the better. A very vague pre-registration, such as this sentence below here, still gives us a lot of different paths if we again think about the garden of forking paths metaphors. For example, if we just propose that construct X is associated with construct Y, and we will collect data on many different tasks to test this hypothesis, there are many different ways to test this hypothesis statistically, and we have a lot of freedom in doing a lot of analysis until we somehow find support for this hypothesis. I also want to talk a little bit about registered reports, because there is some confusion about the difference between pre-registration and registered reports. Basically, a registered report is a special case of a pre-registration, which also includes peer review. So you write the introduction and method section, as well as the planned analysis section, and then you submit it to a journal which accepts this registered report format. This submission is called a stage 1 protocol, which you submit before you start with the data collection. You receive peer review, which of course is not based on whether your results are significant or not, because this stage 1 protocol does not have any data or results yet. But instead, the peer reviewers are asked to evaluate it based on the plausibility of the hypothesis and the quality of the methodology. If the peer reviewers like this paper, if it passes peer review, then you get in principle acceptance. And then you can start with data collection. The first advantage of the registered report format over pre-registration is that you have a guarantee that the paper will be published as a peer review publication in a peer-reviewed journal, even if the results are negative, even if you don't find a significant result. The second advantage is that you get peer review before you start data collection, so any mistakes that you didn't see in the methods will be corrected by the reviewers before you start collecting the data. Now I would like to talk a little bit about frequently asked questions that come up always when at talks about registered reports. Here is a list of frequently asked questions. And I will go through each of them in turn and give my answers to them. The first question that normally comes up is that, well, I want to just collect data and see what happens. How is that wrong? And the answer to that is it's not wrong. It's perfectly fine to do this. This is a classical example of an exploratory study. So you go out, collect data, and then you just analyze it. The point is that we have to make a very clear distinction between confirmatory and exploratory studies. As we have seen, the problem comes when we try to sell exploratory studies as confirmatory studies. So when we use harking to make it look like we expected the results that we found all along after we've already obtained it. Pre-registration in this sense does not in any way devalue exploratory results, but rather it makes the distinction between exploratory and confirmatory studies very clear. If we want to be very conservative, we can say that any study which is not pre-registered should count as an exploratory study. You can, of course, do exploratory non-pre-registered studies, or if you prefer, you can also combine the two. For example, if you are planning to collect data, you have one hypothesis, but you are also collecting some additional variables where you just want to see what happens. You can write a pre-registration, and when you write up the paper, you first have a section in the results section with the title Confirmatory Analysis, where you do the analysis that you described in the pre-registration. And then you have an additional separate section which will be called Exploratory Analysis, where you describe all the additional analyses that you conducted. One of the common concerns about pre-registration and registered report is that you can still cheat. The answer to that is that yes, that is true. Pre-registration cannot prevent fraud, but that's not what it was designed to do. The main purpose of pre-registration is to reduce unintentional questionable research practices. With p-hacking and harking, most researchers do this without being aware that they are doing something wrong and something that results in a systematic bias. All of these researchers will now be forced to think about their research questions and analyses beforehand, and they will have less space to make these unintentional mistakes. If people want to commit fraud, there is very little that can stop them because they will always find a way. But pre-registration has some checks in place which can be effective against some types of fraud. So for example, one concern is that with pre-registration, you can conduct your study, but beforehand you upload a lot of different pre-registrations for this one experiment with many different hypotheses. And then you can link only to the pre-registration that describes the hypothesis that actually worked. This will not work because the pre-registrations are made publicly available. So in some cases, on some platforms, you can choose to put an embargo on a pre-registration, but it will be lifted after 5 years. So if somebody does this, then at least after 5 years, it will become clear. The other thing that some people are worried about is that people might collect the data, analyze it, and then write the pre-registration based on the results that they already found. If you do a registered report, this will not work because reviewers are very likely to recommend some changes to the methods. So if you try this, then you will have to start again anyway, because the reviewers will ask that you change something about the way in which you collect the data. Another common concern is that if you upload your intention to do a study, somebody else might scoop your idea. So they can do the study before you get around to doing it. In principle, this is possible, but not very likely. If you are very worried about this, Most pre-registration platforms also allow you to put your pre-registration on an embargo. So you still have the timestamp, but it is visible only to you, either for 5 years when it just becomes public, or until you choose to make it public yourself. The other thing is that because the pre-registration is time-stamped, it is also in itself a public record of your intention to do the study. So if somebody views your pre-registration, decides to steal your idea and to do your experiment and publish it 1 year later, you can prove that you were the first one to propose the idea. Finally, I would like to address the frequently asked questions. So should all studies be pre-registered? When it comes to clinical trials, the answer is yes. In fact, that's a requirement in most countries that before a drug comes to the market or a medical product comes to the market, its effectiveness needs to be shown in a pre-registered study. The Declaration of Helsinki proposes that every research study involving human subjects must be registered in a publicly accessible database before recruitment of the first subject. For more theoretical research, it is already less clear whether pre-registration is really necessary. I would recommend it whenever it is possible, and I would recommend all researchers to think about doing a pre-registration and to try to write, at least informally for themselves, a pre-registration, because more often than not, it will actually be possible, and researchers might realize that it makes perfect sense to think about your hypothesis and how exactly you will want to test it before you start collecting the data. Having said this, of course, there are studies for which it's not possible, for example, exploratory studies, where it might just be very tricky to pinpoint any exact hypotheses or how you would test them. I would like to conclude with a summary. I hope to have convinced you by now that pre-registration is a very powerful means to reduce p-hacking, publication bias, and harking. Thank you very much for your attention.